Good afternoon. I'm Gary Cunningham, President and CEO of Prosperity Now. Prosperity Now is focused on racial and economic inclusion, specifically ensuring that people of color and Indigenous people can fully participate in our economic structures and systems. We do this by focusing on policy, research, advocacy, and programming that uplifts economic opportunity for all. I want to thank all of you for being here today. This is such an important conversation, one that is long overdue. I want to say a particular thanks to Patrice Kunich, who has developed this session and will be facilitating it with us today. Today, we have three interrelated crises. The COVID crisis has completely disrupted the way we live and work. We have an economic tsunami that has rendered a shocking blow to our economy. And third, the country is in the midst of grappling with its legacy of structural racism, denied opportunity, police violence, and economic exclusion. Most recently, the President of the United States, at the foothills of the Black Hills, Sapa, unleashed a series of comments justifying the cultural heritage of slavery and colonialism that have wreaked havoc on communities of color and Native communities. According to the president, quote, "No movement that seeks to dismantle these treasured American legacies can possibly have a love for America at heart. No person who remains quiet at the destruction of this resplendent heritage can possibly lead us to a better future." We find ourselves in an entirely unfamiliar and uncertain environment. We know that the COVID crisis has not affected all communities in the same way. Though no one individual community is immune from these viruses, systematic barriers and deficits have left certain communities more vulnerable than others. In particular, Indian country has been dealt a serious blow. The reason for this disparate impact are vast, but they all boil down to centuries of systematic barriers and a lack of basic infrastructure to support Native populations. Despite the dire circumstances, we have an opportunity to catalyze the crises for change. I am so excited to have the opportunity to be with friends and to reinvigorate Prosperity Now's relationship with Indian country in this critical moment. Today, we will hear from First Nation leaders from across the country about rebuilding wealth and assets in Indian country. Leadership is absolutely critical in this time of crisis. Organizations that evolve and can adapt and turn challenges into opportunities will be the ones who thrive in the world that comes next. Adaptive leadership requires responding to the present situation with compassion and caring for our communities. All of the panelists representing Native nations and Native serving financial institutions are leaders who will help Indian country overcome the challenges of today, build resiliency, and spark innovation. With that, I will turn it over to Patrice. Thank you all again for joining us today. Patrice.
Today is a good day. Thank you, Gary, for hosting this important conversation and for your commitment to an inclusive collaboration with Indian country. It's a great opportunity to pair Prosperity Now's treasure trove of terrific resources with the exceptional expertise of Native leaders on our panel to propel economic development throughout Indian country. I am steeped in Indian country in my background in law and policy, most recently with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, where I directed the Center for Indian Country Development. And I'm now back at NARF, the Native American Rights Fund, where I started my legal career many years ago. And it feels good to be really uplifting Indian country in big ways. I'd like to welcome everyone online and our panelists to this national conversation on rebuilding assets in Indian country. And for those of you who paid attention to the title of this event, the word rebuilding is slightly modified to really appreciate that Indian country is already steeped with valuable assets and resources. So we're here today to really amplify those opportunities, to further expand these assets, and to use Gary's word, to catalyze community and economic development. Personally, I think this is a really necessary and urgent conversation given the backdrop of the cascading and compounding impacts of the global pandemic and the racial reckoning unfolding in every corner of our country. And I recently moved from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I saw firsthand the events unfolding post George Floyd and the American Indian community. So this is a very necessary conversation. And we must know that business enterprise and social welfare are two sides of the larger issue. So it's also an essential conversation about the role of good governance in fostering inclusive growth, embracing innovative solutions to big problems, and accelerating the recovery process. So optimally, we are creating really a durable infrastructure for flourishing communities in the future. So the format of this conversation, I will introduce our panelists first, and then I'll engage each of them in a round of conversations. I'm encouraging them to converse with each other, ask each other's questions, and we'd love to have your questions as well. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. In alphabetical order, we have Jackson Rossi. He's the Executive Director of the National Native CDFI Network and a colleague of mine, former colleague of mine. He's coming to us from Washington, D.C. Tani Brunch, who you can't see on the screen, is joining us on the phone. She's the Executive Director of Lakota Funds on Pine Ridge, which apparently is under a lockdown order. So she's coming to us via phone. Michael Roberts, he's the Executive Director of First Nations Development Institute. He's in New Mexico and Colorado. We have Lynn Trujillo. Lynn is the Secretary of Indian Affairs in the state of New Mexico. She's coming to us from Santa Fe. And Tony Walters, the Executive Director of the National American Indian Housing Council, located in DC, but he's joining us from Oklahoma. So thank you. We're representing Indian country far and wide. So I thought I would start with tribal and state leaders and then move to the national scene. We had Chairman Brian Newland from the Bay Mills Indian community scheduled to join us, and he had a medical emergency. But Brian, as a chairman of the community, has really had to make some hard decisions. But Secretary Trujillo, you've seen it up close and personal. You're a member of the Sandia Pueblo, and you're affiliated with other pueblos as well. I really want to thank you for your leadership in New Mexico during this chaotic time in public health. It's really important, I think, to acknowledge at the outset that the Pueblos and the Navajo Nation in New Mexico have suffered per capita some of the worst tragedies of this pandemic. So you have a personal stake in this in many ways. You know, it seems to me that the state of New Mexico and the Native nations in New Mexico have formed a really strong partnership to tackle both the public health crisis and the economic development calamity. So can you tell us a bit about how those relationships were formed and how important are these government-to-government relationships in this time of crisis?
Thanks, Patrice, and thank you, everybody. And I'm very honored to be a part of this discussion and with my panelists that are here today, some old friends. It's nice to see you all. But here in New Mexico, I mean, I think we have 23 sovereign nations here that I interface with and work with in terms of tribal leadership. And we have really good partnerships in place. A lot of that has to do with the State Tribal Collaboration Act that we have here in New Mexico, which provides for, you know, increased collaboration between the governor's office, but as well as our sister departments and agencies. And for me, it's really important, as you mentioned, Patrice. I'm a member of Sandia Pueblo. I also am part Taos and Acoma Pueblos and have family in those communities. It's not only impacting, you know, my community, but all our communities here. And so really invested in ensuring that our tribal leaders are supported, our tribal communities are also supported in terms of resources. And I think the Indian Affairs Department is really critical in terms of being that hub for information, as well as the connector between our other departments and the governor's office and the tribal leadership. I'm really proud of the work that our state has done under the leadership of Governor Lujan Grisham. In response to COVID, the Indian Affairs Department actually put forth a manual for tribal leaders and communities to respond to COVID. And we also worked closely with our state to deploy over 2 million pounds of food to our tribal communities here, as well as critical PPE. Right now, we're really focused on ensuring that there's access to increased testing in our tribal communities, as well as contact tracing, which is vital to staying on top of the pandemic that's here. And really, there's just a tremendous amount of support from our state. I think for me personally, it's not only being from the Pueblo communities here, but my work as general counsel for my own Pueblo has, you know, helped me seen how we need to build relationships with our state and federal partners, which is really important. I also think the work that I did, where I know some of you on the panel from, was when I worked for USDA Rural Development across the nation and building those relationships that are vital to our tribal communities, because that access point is really important. The department has really done a very good job where we have weekly tribal leader calls with our leadership to keep them abreast and informed, and really to keep a pulse on what's going on in our tribal communities, to make sure that access to resources are available and that we do everything that we can to support our tribal leadership here in New Mexico.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary Trujillo. And I really also appreciate the good work you did at USDA Rural Development, reaching out to Native communities and bringing the possibility of infrastructure development far and wide. Tani, let's turn to you. I know you were instrumental in creating the first ever Native Community Development Financial Institution on an American Indian reservation. And since then, Lakota Funds has been a principal player in revitalizing the Pine Ridge Reservation's economy. And I think a good part of Lakota Fund's success has been the way and the manner in which you've engaged with your customers to build and maintain their financial assets. And so, for example, I've been so inspired by the experience that you've shared with us about transforming longtime renters into homeowners. And then for the first time, they've been able to possess a real equity interest in their homes. So since the onset of the pandemic, how has Lakota Funds managed to stay engaged with the community, and what are they asking of you?
Great, Patrice, thank you very much for including me. and to participate in this discussion. And so, yeah, for 34 years, Lakota Funds has been around for 34 years. And although that time has been spent, primarily the focus has always been in pursuing our mission of building the economy here on the Pine Ridge Reservation. So for the majority of that time, we focused on the business loans and the technical assistance. Over the course of those 34 years, we've assisted 800 businesses that's either start up or expand, creating 2,000 jobs and deployed just over $15 million. So we focused on the businesses, the technical assistance pieces, but then also in the asset development work. And that's where we continue to serve the needs of this community. We've had to change, how we're doing that due to the COVID and stuff, but it is still focused on the technical assistance pieces, a lot around the budget coaching and the credit coaching. The classes, which used to be in person, have now moved to Zoom and an online platform, but we continue to provide that outreach. Because the asset development piece is huge, not only in maintaining our relationship with the community. That's how normally, we're introduced to clients and learn about their goals, either for asset development, or for starting or expanding a business. So we continue to maintain that in the community, but then it's also through, we still offer our match savings programs, although we've changed the focus of that, mainly due to the kind of the pivot is the word these days, right? Pivot of the funding sources, priorities. And so the match savings programs, where it used to be offered for business startup or expansion, are now we have match savings programs for home ownership. And that is primarily due to, what we're get to assist our families with in achieving home ownership at Eagle Nest Housing. In addition to the match savings, we've been doing VITA. We're free tax certified free tax preparers, and we've been VITA site for 12 years. I often joke, and not so much jokingly anymore, as I continue to approach that age of retirement, wherever that may be, that even if I would retire, I would still choose to be a VITA volunteer, because it's such rewarding work. And that's kind of, again, our contact, our relationship with the community, that we had the opportunity to continue to assist our families, with the extension of the tax deadline and stuff, and the importance of knowing that our families needed to file their tax return before they were eligible for some of these, the COVID relief packages.
Sure.
So we had the opportunity to do that. And then, of course, with Lakota Federal Credit Union, probably our biggest asset development tool, right, was a charge that was led by Lakota Funds, and I continue to serve as the board chair. But we achieved that, received the charter there for the only federally insured financial institution in 2012. And so, of course, with the credit union being so critical, in it being the only in-person access to an individual's savings accounts and their direct deposits, the credit union has actually, remained open. Some of the time with phone transactions or online transactions only, but for the last 2 weeks, the credit union has actually also had its lobby doors open, and it makes you feel good, honestly, seeing how much our community has embraced the credit union and is utilizing the products and services, the savings accounts, the consumer loans, the direct deposit, and being forced in some ways to utilize the other tools, the remote capture for depositing their checks and the online banking. So we remain critical to the community and in constant communication with the community that way. But like you mentioned, Patrice, Eagle Nest Housing was actually the first LIHTC project on a reservation. And so with that, and I think that we started building those units 1996, and I think finished in 1998. So in 2016, we were actually fully released from all of the LIHTC restrictions. I think the South Dakota Housing Development Authority couldn't wait to be done with managing that project. There was a lot of turnover. Although those units were built, there are 30 units of single-family homes that are just outside of Wambaleisha, about 8 miles from where I am right now. They were built with the intent to be rent-to-own. And then I think just with some of the challenges around keeping families in those homes, the constant turnover, the constant kind of maintenance and renovations that were needed to those units, they became very expensive and just hard to manage. But I think at that point we didn't even realize how little people knew about home ownership. I mean, knew about ownership or embraced ownership just in general, let alone home ownership. And so in 2016, when we were finally released from those restrictions and could pursue that home ownership piece just full bore, it was really then that I think all of us began to kind of learn what was needed and really began those deeper relationships with some of the families there to help them embrace the idea of ownership and understand that it's okay to own something. It's okay to have, the confidence in knowing that you're going to be here for, many years and then even have an asset, a home to pass on to your future generations. And so that was really the turning point with that, where I think people started coming around and understanding that this was a good thing. So since then, we've sold 11 of those 30 units, those 30 homes, and we'll be closing on our 12th one next month. And that I'm especially excited about because it is the first home that will also be a home mortgage, the first home mortgage that Lakota Federal Credit Union is approving. And so we've decided to go ahead and have the credit union be doing the home mortgages as well. So and it's for a veteran, a Native American veteran. So we're pretty excited about that closing. But the other ways that we're staying in contact with just constant communication with the community, and especially as a result of COVID, is with our construction internship program. So the construction internship program is run under actually South Dakota Native Homeownership Coalition, which is a coalition was pretty much started by Elsie. She gathered Elsie Meeks, of course, who was at the time the state director of rural development. But Elsie just got together the right people in the room and said, you know what, this is enough. We need to figure out. She was mostly frustrated that we weren't doing enough. The state wasn't doing enough rural development 502 loans. But she got the right people in the room, and we ended up forming this coalition of kind of the stakeholders that include federal agencies, state agencies, banks, credit unions, CDFIs, all the practitioners, the housing authorities, all in an effort to help more Native families achieve home ownership. So it's really under her direction, and now Lakota Funds is the fiscal agent and the lead organization. But it is under the coalition that we run the construction internship program.
Great. Yeah, we need champions like Elsie Meeks and your perseverance to make this all work and to sustain the progress. Let me turn to Tony Walters, who's joining us from Oklahoma. And Tony, in hearing Tawny talk about bolstering the housing market on Pine Ridge, we know that the U.S. housing market generally is under intense pressure right now. But Indian country, we're realizing the direct link between housing and community health and well-being. And we've seen that the chronic shortages and overcrowded living conditions are responsible for exacerbating the spread of the virus and impeding the containment of it. So we must build more homes, right? For health and safety reasons, as well as for economic development. So what's in your toolbox? What do you see the National American Indian Housing Council being able to help us address this nationwide housing crisis in Indian country?
Thanks, Patrice, and thanks for having me as part of the discussion today. Appreciate being with everyone. The National American Indian Housing Council, our members are the tribal housing programs across the country, right? So when we talk about what are the resources out there, our job as a national organization is to highlight all the resources that are out there for those members, and they're the ones who would put those resources to use in their communities and really try to develop and build those homes that are desperately needed across the Indian country. We're still looking at kind of the older data for 2017. It was a HUD report, I think, for overcrowded homes, mentioned that 1 in 6 homes in tribal communities was overcrowded. So when you think about that, and that's, I think, the number of times the national average, I think, is 2 to, it was a giant number. It's much bigger than the national average. I think the national average is like 2%. For Indian country, it's about 16%. And when you think about the times we live in now and a pandemic that's going through the entire nation, that's a direct impact on homes. You have multiple generations living in the same home under the same roof. You can't really social distance when you've got, a number of family members in the same home. So, the tools that we have as an organization are sharing kind of the best practices and success stories that are across the country and across Indian country in particular. We do that usually through, in-person events. We usually do 3 national events a year. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that. We had to cancel our annual conference just last month. But trying to find a new way to share those stories, right? And these webinars and short, newsletters and things like that we send out, trying to just become better at finding those stories, successful stories, and sharing those back to the members. Because every housing department out there, tribal housing department, is looking for ideas and what's possible. When we had a survey from our members 2 years ago, we asked how many, which federal programs or other state programs that tribes are utilizing to develop homes in their community. And almost all of them, there was only a small handful, were using funds outside of HUD funds. And that's, the NAHASDA block grant, Indian Community Development block grant, even USDA programs, which seem tailor-made for a lot of our tribal communities, not a lot of implementation in tribal communities. And not for lack of trying. I think there's a lot of effort on both sides and just trying to connect the dots and getting the right people in the room at the same time. In conjunction with all the other pieces that have to fall into place for development in tribal communities. So it's been our issue. That's our main issue. We do training and technical assistance back to those housing programs to really help them, bolster their programs, get them in a position that's ready. So when they see an opportunity for funding or whatever resources that are out there, they can put that to use in their community and build some homes. Because that is one of the biggest issues in the country, is just the housing shortage across the board for a lot of our communities.
Great. I'm going to come back to you and talk about interest rates. But Jackson, let me turn to you. And I think a lot of folks have been wondering about whether the CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions, qualify for CARES Act funding. And how was that distributed and used? And was it an equitable distribution? I mean, did Indian country get both what it needed and funding levels that can be really used to deploy these good programs, housing, health, and well-being throughout Indian country?
Great question. And on the surface, CDFIs, for the most part, were eligible to be lenders in the $660 billion PPP Paycheck Protection Program, which sounds great. And initially, we were quite excited about that. But unfortunately, the devils are in the details, and there were limits to the size of the CDFIs in order for them to qualify to be lenders in the program, and which basically eliminated all but 2 Native CDFIs from participating as lenders. So we have 70 Native CDFIs across the country that are certified, about 20 more that are up and coming, and about 2 of them were able to participate as lenders, and those were bank CDFIs. And so we think that that's horrible. It's unacceptable. We've made We'd made several statements about it, and it's unfortunate. So we think that the programs like the PPP really missed the mark when it came to working with native CDFIs. If we want to address things like banking deserts, we should the Congress should work directly with native CDFIs that are out there and exist because there are banking deserts. So we're a bit disappointed about that, but we're going to keep moving forward. Yeah, so, but I could go on for another 25 minutes talking about this.
Sure. So are you taking an advocacy role in either the qualification limits or engaging and lifting up your native CDFIs?
Yeah, so one of the great things about, the good things about us being located in Washington, D.C. is that we're able to make these connections right away. We've sent several letters. Our members have sent several letters, and we've had folks like Sharice Davids and Deb Hall and lean out on our behalf with the Small Business Administration and the Treasury. And we're going to keep moving forward with these pieces of advocacy. But I think it's also great that we're here talking with a broader audience, like our friends here in Prosperity Now. And actually, we have a couple of slides photos I want to share. But Prosperity Now and Native CDFIs and CFED really have a great partnership going back quite a ways. And here's a picture I took when I first visited Prosperity Now. It says Happy 35th Anniversary CFED. And this is given from the Native CDFI Network. And folks like Tanya Fiddler and Sherry Salway Black, I want to acknowledge them. They really made the connection with CFED and Prosperity Now, because Native CDFIs and folks like Prosperity Now, our missions are very much aligned. We are about asset building, and I appreciate the way that this was framed, asset rebuilding. When it comes to Indian country, it's important for folks and our allies to be reminded that Indian country, we have had prosperity is not a foreign concept to Indian country. Poverty is not inherent to Indian country, but there have been several examples and several things that have happened to our folks. And my folks, like Navajo, we've had our crops and our animals burned and destroyed by the federal government, and we work to rebuild them over and over. And so I think that looking at framing this as rebuilding is important, and I think it's great that Prosperity Now is doing that and giving us this platform to reach out to more folks, so that things like the PPP, if there is something like that down the road, that native CDFIs in banking deserts can participate. So thanks.
Good. Yeah, the advocacy is so important, and that advocacy based on good information, good data, also really carries the message a long way. So let me turn to Mike. And Mike, the First Nations Development Institute has had a tremendous impact across Indian country in many ways. And personally, I've relied on your team's terrific data analysis and research reports. So the big question that we're grappling with right now is, how do we have a more inclusive economy? And what interventions do you see are needed to ensure Indian country is really fully participating in the national economic recovery scene and creating sustainable economies?
Yeah, first of all, Patrice and Gary, thank you for allowing me to speak. I'm kind of captured by the moment. I mean, Gary let out the conversation with, we're in the middle of a triple threat, right? A pandemic, an economic tsunami, and racial and societal unrest. That's the story of Indian country for the past 500 plus years, right? This is our lived experience. We recently worked on a film with a guy named Sanjay Rao, and in that film there was a speaker, Nephi Craig, who's a chef from White Mountain Apache, And I was struck by this quote from Nephi in the film. He said, for Indian people, we are just now emerging from the other side of the apocalypse, right? And so I think that when you think about framing it that way, and you look at all that Indian country has achieved in that emergence, I think there's hope for Indian country to, one, maintain, and two, to really leave lessons for the rest of the country on how we emerge from this apocalypse, if it is so. So, First Nations has been around for 40 years. We had a hand in a couple of the other organizations that are on this call. We were the national partner to Lakota Fund when the Pine Ridge community folks wanted to start that CDFI, and we were one of the charter members of the National Indian CDFI network. So it's good to see like a lasting legacy here, on the panel with us there at First Nations. I think that the story about inclusive economy has always been a story of what we are trying to get done here at First Nations. And we've recognized early on that Indian country has been deliberately isolated, and that the infrastructure of Indian country has been intentionally underbuilt, whether that's physical infrastructure or technological infrastructure. And in many cases, the human infrastructure of Indian country has not been addressed in a meaningful way. And so that a lot of the work that we do here at First Nations is trying to make sure that Indian country has a place at the table in these national conversations. And we're here again. During the last recession, 2008 to 2009, philanthropic funding to Indian country fell off a cliff. 37.5% reduction of philanthropic funding to Indian country was gone overnight. This is compared to what other social justice organizations saw as a loss of only about 20%. So our loss in philanthropic funding, which is pretty paltry to begin with, was about 2x what the rest of the nation and the rest of the social justice movement encountered. And I think that when we look at, a recovery or a rebuilding or whatever we want to call the next phase, well, first of all, let's just talk about it for a minute. We're not over the kind of the pandemic and the relief that needs to happen now. But when we pivot, if we do get a chance to pivot and talk about recovery, we need to ensure that Indian country doesn't fall off a similar cliff, right? That this doesn't happen twice, because when you look at the number of dollars being given to Indian country in a given year by philanthropic organizations, only about 45 million is given to Indian controlled institutions. You take 37% of that off the table, we're down to about $25 to $28 million going to Indian country. I don't know about you, but that's not much money in my mind. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'd love to have that much money a year coming to my organization. But when you look at kind of the world at large, that's not a lot of money, and a whole bunch of Indian country organizations trying to fight for those very few dollars. So I think the conversation really needs to focus on this equity. We're having a conversation about equity in this country right now, and inclusivity, and I'm heartened by things like the conversations that are happening in our nation's capital around the naming of the football team. Long overdue. It's unfortunate it had to take Black Lives Matter for Indian country to count in this conversation, right? But I'm heartened by the conversation. I'm heartened that our Black and Brown brothers and sisters are including us in the equity conversation, because these things are long overdue. And I think that's kind of the opportunity of the moment for Indian country, is to step up and sit at the table that we've fought so hard to be at.
Oh, thanks. That's fantastic. And thanks for bringing that around to social justice. So, Lynn, let me come back to you. One of the most lasting symptoms we're seeing of the COVID-19 pandemic will be the layers of inequity that it's exposed, as Mike was sharing, particularly the economic vulnerability of people of color, Indigenous. So going forward, how do you envision, for example, the state of New Mexico as a government, as a state, with quite a lot of both power and clout, to address these institutional barriers that are probably very endemic in its own structure, to really create shared prosperity for those 23 Native nations in your state?
I think, Patrice, and thanks, Mike. I mean, I think the hopefulness is that we have an incredible opportunity in light of a pandemic and possible recession and the economics of where we're at. But I see it as opportunity. We all are aware, because we're from the communities, we worked in our communities, of just the disparities that exist. It just happened to take COVID, a pandemic, to shine a light on that, right? The severe lack of infrastructure that we have. And as Mike mentioned, you know, here in New Mexico, I think about many of our tribal areas, like Navajo Nation, and we can say, you know, wash your hands, but if you don't have access to water and that type of infrastructure, I mean, it makes it really difficult. And I mean, how long has that been there? It's been exacerbated for many, 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 many years. I think the same with respect to telecommunications and broadband, that really many people take for granted. And how now, you know, you see the nation and state saying, well, we can school our kids from home. We can, you know, you can try to telework. You can do that if you have access to the infrastructure. And many of our tribal communities don't have that. And even critical things such as telehealth, which is being touted, and I understand the importance of that, is just not accessible in some of our communities. And so for us, as in terms of New Mexico, I think we do that together in collaboration with our tribal nations. That's where their voice is important. That's what they know their communities, and we, I think, as a department, and many of us in our positions, can help advocate. But our best advocates are our tribal communities and leaders. And I think helping to support that is really important. Here in New Mexico, you know, we've been able to also, you asked me earlier about partnerships and having that trust with our tribal leaders and our tribal communities, but we've also been able to expand that partnership with folks like the Native American Budget and Policy Institute here through UNM. And they have completed a report for us, which we hope to use to advocate for funds during the legislative session, knowing that we're in a shortfall, but and we'll put these on our websites, but it's looking at a broadband report as well as the economic impact of COVID in our tribal communities. And so through our partnerships, we've been able to add resources, and hopefully those resources can help our tribal leaders and communities advocate for those increased resources. And that needs to happen in partnership, because our tribal leaders are going to help us know where to target the resources in our communities, the best ways that are most impactful here in New Mexico.
Good, good. We've heard a lot about infrastructure needs, the underdevelopment, the underbuilding of infrastructure. So I'm going to ask anyone on the panel, what kind of positive investment opportunities are there for investors in Indian country? We've heard a lot about program-related investments. We've heard Mike talk about philanthropic support. But if we were to look at Indian country, where do you see? Is it in the housing market, Tony? Is it in the access to capital, Jackson? Tani, where do you see investment opportunities?
All of the above. And especially for the Native CDFIs that are located on the reservation, where they are the only financial institution. We're pillars, honestly, and I used to be like embarrassed to even refer to us that way, but honestly, especially amid so much chaos, Lakota Funds is a constant, and people are coming to us, not only our own borrowers, our own portfolio of businesses, are going to be relying on us more and more. But there's also going to be a whole new pool of businesses that are probably going to be in a position, you know what I mean, where they're performing, their sales have declined and everything else, where the banks that used to be willing to assist them aren't going to be willing to do that anymore. We're going to have a larger role to play. Right now, mostly because of the prompting and relationship I have with Zach Duchneau around our ag lending and stuff, he challenged me to go out and find the number that we need an investment right now. And it's $15 million. Honestly, we have the demand.
Wow, just a second, Tommy. What did you just say? $15 million in agriculture investment?
$15 million is what we can do in ag loans just based on the Pine Ridge Reservation. We serve the Pine Ridge Reservation and Rosebud. If we would, you know, be able to expand that, even we've just scratched the surface. We basically creating the demand, and that was largely because of the original, you know, loan capital through a grant through the Keep Seagull and now Native American Ag Fund that we've received, where, you know, our individual Native ranchers understood that they didn't have to go to the FSA and be denied anymore. They could come to Lakota Funds, who they already have a relationship with, already feel comfortable with, get the loans that they need to purchase the livestock and grow their ranch and be able to pass it on to future generations with that same FSA guarantee. And it's just, the demand is, you know, every year is met by us, but the truth is we could expand it if we had more loan capital.
Oh, that is fantastic. Jackson, do you see this as an opportunity to invest in CDFIs or to attract investments in Native CDFIs?
Absolutely. So, and Tani's really a great example of a leader in a Native CDFI who's really performing at a very high level and performing work that otherwise is not being done in banking deserts. And so, as I mentioned, there are 70 certified Native CDFIs out there. And if there are partners that want to partner, there are a couple different ways. You can reach out directly, and I'm sure they'd love to have a grant first and foremost. But if that's not part of the equation, there are things like EQ2s, which are equity equivalent investments that a private individual or a foundation could make into a CDFI, a nonprofit CDFI. Most Native CDFIs are nonprofit. And then they can then in turn use that capital to make loans or help with other parts of their business plan. So I think something like that could make a very big difference. There are 570 plus Native tribal nations across the country, yet there are about 70 Native CDFIs across the country. So we think the opportunity to grow is immense, and I'm not advocating that every single tribal nation should have a CDFI, and there's opportunity for partnership, but between 570 versus 70, I think there's a whole lot more room to grow. And I think if we're talking equality and equity, let's talk about EQ2 investments in Native CDFIs.
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, just to throw in some advertising. About a week ago, First Nations formally spun off First Nations Owista Corporation, and it's now Owista Corporation is its own independent entity. And I'd be remiss if I didn't stand up and advertise the work that Owista does. They take capital on a national level. I always tell people they take wholesale capital and break it down into retail parts for community CDFIs, and I think that many of Jackson's members are borrowers from Owista's portfolio, and
yes.
That's a function. Not only they've performed for a very long time, much of the growth from that 2 CDFIs, which is the Lakota Fund and one other, 20 years ago to the 70 plus now, can be attributed to a lot of the hard work that folks at Owista have done. But equally so, Owista also plays a part in the not only the capitalization, but the technical assistance and training that Jackson and others have talked about, and the necessity for that, and on the advocacy part, speaking at places like SOCAP and others, about both the opportunity and the need for investing in Indian CDFIs.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Crystal Cornelius was invited and wasn't able to join us at the last minute due to some health reasons, but OESTA as a national intermediary has been at the forefront of some very innovative processes. We worked very hard, and Tani was part of this too with the South Dakota Indian Homeownership Coalition to do relending, to have OESTA be relenders of the the USDA Rural Development Program. So OESTA is a huge player in this. But speaking of housing and HUD housing, Tony, I told you I'd come back to you about interest rates. We are seeing unprecedentedly low interest rates, and it just feels almost compelling that we would go to the market at this time, use these low-cost funds to build homes. What do you see in terms of tribes, these tribal, your members, tribal housing directors being able to take advantage of this, these interest rates, build new homes, increase the infrastructure capacity in the community?
Sure, thanks, Patrice. I wish there was probably a better answer to the question, that there was an easier answer of just saying yes to that, and that we should all or could all be taking better advantage of this. But for Indian country, there's been a lot of low interest programs out there already established, right? So we didn't need kind of this private interest rates to be where they are now. It's just a matter of total development costs for these projects, infrastructure costs, just higher for these tribal projects. So we're still at a point where we're trying to take advantage of the programs that have been established and still need to be improved upon. But to your question about an individual being able to apply for some of these low interest mortgages, I certainly love to see a lot more Native Americans be able to take advantage of that. One of the surveys that we did 2 years ago was asking our tribal housing programs what the biggest barrier to home ownership or home construction was. And you might think it's trust land issues, it's BIA or whoever, but the resounding answer to that question was people just aren't ready. They don't have the credit history, they don't have the credit to become a homeowner. So, no matter what the rates are, if you don't have that credit history, not a lot of people are going to be able to take advantage of that. I think one thing that we've done as an organization, we've kind of ramped up our home buyer education courses that we do. We provide training to the tribal professionals that then go into their community and try to identify those prospective home buyers to put themselves in better positions. We try to partner up with groups like the Credit Builders Alliance to identify ways for tribes themselves to start reporting payments that their individual members make to them for rent, things like that. So trying to help people build their credit in these tribal communities so they can take advantage of some of the rates that we're seeing. And, I think in parts of the country, New Mexico, I think is a very great example, and folks there can talk about. There has been a lot of success lending there and creating new development. There's, I think, one of the projects you highlighted from the Center for Indian Country Development was at San Felipe, and that's a giant subdivision.
I was just going to say that the San Felipe's been a fantastic example of putting together both public and private funds, and that's where the relationships come about. And Lynn, speaking of San Felipe, there are many layers of financing. It wasn't all public, USDA or HUD. The Pueblo really had to be very sophisticated in, I think, putting together 10 different financial instruments to pull this off. Are you seeing this level of participation in the market, going out, being creative, trying to pull things together? And Jackson, maybe you can weigh in as well as what are some of these barriers? Tony mentioned a few, in sort of a household way, but how do we get rid of these barriers and build more homes like San Felipe?
I think Patrice, about comment before Jackson. I mean, with respect to San Felipe, I think there you had a really dedicated housing authority director, right? So I think that, and the resources, like the buy-in from the Pueblo too. I mean, when I've talked with their housing director, that was really, and it's, I think at the heart here is like partnerships and building out those partnerships and kind of not being limited to one funding stream or one particular partner. That's how I think San Felipe was able to do that. You know, the tribe invested, they had to put a little bit of investment in that, but they also utilized a whole host of programs outside of just funding. I think
to the good governance part of the conversation is
right. And what does that mean if we're talking about reinvesting? We all have a role, right? You have the individual who might want their own home. What do they need to do to do that? What does the community need to do? What do our federal partners and policymakers need to do? And in order to create that equity in terms of the larger structural frameworks, especially where we have fierce advocates like Congresswoman Deb Haaland from New Mexico. You know, maybe this is an opportunity for us to change some of those policies and regulations. As Tony mentioned, there's already in relation to housing products out there. Why? So what is it that isn't allowing us to be able to utilize them? You know, probably the regulations and some of the programmatic aspects of all these different programs. And then the last thing I just want to say is I just want to tout Native CDFIs. I think Native CDFIs are critical. I feel like they're outside of Indian country, really undervalued. They need to have access to capital, more access to capital. They're trusted voices in our tribal communities. And here in New Mexico, I know that the Native Community Capital Fund here, like they continue to go out of pocket to train and recruit Native entrepreneurs throughout COVID. And here at Indian Affairs, we realize, and I think there's an interesting opportunity for us here, even on this call. I'm really interested to partner with some folks because I'm really concerned about unemployment. And already our Native communities were underemployed and unemployed. And now we have a pandemic. And, you know, what do we do to help continue to support our cadre of strong Native entrepreneurs? And our department, through an appropriation, was able to provide seed money to Native Women Lead. And now they have a fund that they're lending out to women, Native women throughout the state. They're utilizing their capital. I think that's something that we can look to, that we already know about, which goes back to, I think somebody had mentioned, but really the core values of our tribal communities. I think, Mike, you might have mentioned it. We already have some of these really strong core values established, and that sense of helping each other out to bring capital across all our communities.
So Jackson, over to you. We need this capital. You know, how do we relieve ourselves of these barriers and burdens?
Well, I think I agree with everything everybody said, and Lynn's spot on about the Native CDFIs in New Mexico Community Capital and TIVA Lending Services have done a great job. One thing our friends at Native Community Capital say is that if they had more funding for training and home buyer training, for example, that would help connect this kind of the demand over here is so high, and also the capacity, the supply of capital, which could be at a low rate, to connect them, because a lot of it's the getting back to the asset building reason we're here is that a lot of financial education and literacy is taught in homes. And so if you're coming from a Native home that hasn't traditionally gotten a mortgage, it'd be helpful to have that training beforehand. And that's something that banks don't invest in and they don't want to invest in. And if you're a Native CDFI working in an underbanked community where folks don't have that background already, folks like Native Community Capital invest some money in home buyer education, but that adds to the cost of their services, and that adds and diminishes the amount of work they can do. But if they're investments from private individuals, if they're investments from state governments who have a lot of CARES Act funding now, investments from tribal governments, and investments from federal governments in things like home buyer training, then connect that demand with that supply and that capacity. So I think that focusing on home buyer education would go great long ways, and the vehicles for that would be Native CDFIs that are already doing that work.
We heard that a few times from Tony as well. So Mike, I'm coming back to you, and you recently partnered with Nonprofit Quarterly. I thought that was a fantastic report to highlight the leadership in Indian country and the need for greater philanthropic support. You've mentioned that earlier. But what I want to ask you is not just how does Indian country secure that support? I think that's the overarching question here, but I think equally important is how do we unpack the capacity in Indian country in the broadest way, the human capacity, the economic capacity, now more than ever?
Yeah. So a couple thoughts here. I mean, I was really taken by Jackson's comment about, you know, the essential place that CDFIs play in Indian country, and especially as we're pivoting to, you know, rebuilding and redevelopment. I mean, I would argue that, you know, as I shared earlier, that Indian country has been on this recovery for 500 years, right? And it's not lost on me that, you know, CDFIs are a big part. I would argue that the not-for-profit community in general has been an essential building block for healthy economies in Indian country, because they're providing very much needed capacity building services that aren't offered other places, right? When you look at reservation economies, you see for the most part a very strong centralized government sector, whether that's federal or tribal government, but you see a pretty anemic for-profit and not-for-profit sector. And in our 40 years of work, we've recognized in order for that for-profit sector to be stood up, you're going to need to have the capacity and the functionality of the not-for-profit sector making that happen. And CDFIs are a perfect example of that. You mentioned the leadership and the capacity of Indian country. We have argued for our entire existence at First Nations that this isn't about lack of human capacity in Indian country, that there is true genius in Indian country. I was in venture capital for 5 years and probably looked at thousands, if not, probably, or at least hundreds of business plans. And when I left there and came back to First Nations, people asked me, like, you know, what is the difference between what you're doing in Indian country and what you did in venture capital? And I always told them that the difference was the number of zeros after the dollar sign that people were asking for. It wasn't the genius of the social entrepreneurs we were investing in. And so I don't think it's a matter of lack of capacity in Indian country. I think it's lack of opportunity. And we talk about this all the time at First Nations, especially with regard to the philanthropic investment in Indian capacity building that it's been so underinvested in for so long. Less than 1/4%, 23/100% of philanthropic capital goes into Indian-controlled institutions. For a population that makes up about 2% of the U.S. population, that's you know, we could increase that number 8-fold and just get equality, not even equity, right? And I always laugh at my white male friends that if I were a white male running a not-for-profit, the $8 million I raised last year would be $64 million, and let's compare apples to apples on that one, right? So I mean, I think the capacity is there, you know, and I'm willing to put Indian country entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs head to head with any other population out there. Again, I think the opportunity is about opportunity, not about capacity, and I think that that's where we really need to start leveling this playing field, whether that's the philanthropic investment or the federal government investment or the for-profit community's investment in Indian country.
Fantastic. Tommy, I'm going to throw a big one at you. What is your call to action? What what do you see Pine Ridge, in 5 to 10 years? What's your vision? And using this opportunity, as Mike was saying, to really propel us forward. What does that look like for you?
Oh, we're definitely seeing improvement, really, just in all areas, not only in the growing our businesses and stuff, but I'm pretty excited about. It seems weird, but with this COVID kind of reality that we're in now, where we've seen an increase for home ownership. As you know, Mazda Scott is the Native CDFI in Pine Ridge that does home mortgages, and I've been lucky enough to be on their board for 12 years. They're seeing an increase in loan demand for home ownership. And so what we're doing, and we're absolutely, you can't go wrong by investing in Native CDFIs, whether it's a business lender like Lakota Funds or the credit union, who is also a Native CDFI, or in Mazda Scott, who's doing the home mortgages, because not only do we have the flexibility to offer the kind of loan products that work for our community, and we know our community. So we do that. If we're not able to do a loan, it's probably because we lack the loan capital, right? So, but what they're seeing with the increase in demand, and I think it's partly due to the fact that, we've had the community attending our classes, whether it's the financial literacy, but more specifically the homebuyer education. For years, we've been doing that, and I think it's finally with people being stuck at home and forced to isolate or whatever, that they're finally realizing that they want to make some improvements or they're ready for their new home. And so we're seeing an increase in applications at Mazda Scott. But the other big part about that is that we also, because Lakota Fund's portfolio is about 32% construction, contractors and construction-related businesses. Those businesses are booming. Those businesses have never been shut down throughout Pine Ridge, throughout the COVID crisis, and they've been the ones who have been able to continue working, very well performing loans, good businesses. But we also, as Native CDFIs, have the ability under that technical assistance, category, to be able to do the other things that include workforce development. So we know, because half of the population here on Pine Ridge is under 21, what a huge opportunity. We've got that kind of workforce, that age, who already probably have some background in construction or plumbing, or my dad was an electrician, was an electrical contractor, you're just used to doing it. You grow up that way, maybe you're enrolled in the trades program at Oklahoma Lakota College, maybe you're not, maybe you're just working anyway. We've been able to place those individuals with the local contractors and pay them, I think we're paying them $12 an hour this year, but for 10 weeks. So it's not only providing employment opportunities, but hands-on experience. They're forming that rapport with the contractor. Many of those individuals have been hired on as full-time employees. Employment opportunities, it's good for the contractor because it helps them build their business. It's good for Mazda Scott because we have families who've been waiting for basements to be poured or homes to be built, and now those interns can help that contractor do that. It's just a win-win. And so I think absolutely support the Native CDFIs, invest in them. They're doing, if anything's being done in a Native community, it's probably being done by Native CDFI.
That's fantastic, and it addresses the concern that Lynn brought up earlier about underemployment, and really trying to make sure that the community, the workforce has skill development. The partnership with tribal colleges and universities is a fantastic idea, so that you're really broadening both the community involvement, creating skills, but a real diversity as well.
Well, we're used to unemployment. Patrice, we're at 80 to 85% unemployment. This is not new for us, right? And so we know in some ways, if one of the employees, chances are you should start your own business, right? it's just this is not new to us, honestly, and I feel like in some ways that's why, especially like Pine Ridge Reservation was in a better position, to be able to withstand, this COVID thing that is affecting outside of the reservation boundaries a lot harder than it is inside here, because we're used to it. It's never been easy here. I've got business owners that know that it's going to take probably more than their business income to make it. And so that's what we've been doing, and that's why my portfolio continues to perform.
Well, speaking of housing, it seems to be a common thread here that we've had a comment from the audience participation, and one of those comments was shared was that they're seeing an increased demand for multi-generational households, not just single family, but multi-generational. So, and it's not easy to protect family, our grandparents, and so forth. So do we envision, Tony, do you envision sort of a new concept of how we build residential communities around Native families and so forth?
Well, I don't know if it's a new vision. I think every tribe has their own, right? I think, what I think we would like to see is just more innovation. And what I mean by that is, just better understanding of what your own community's needs are, whether it is, if it's a young population, more multi-family units or apartment type style, moving them, having that transitional, housing stock from apartments to single family homes to bigger developments or sub communities like that to where a family can live 2 homes next to each other, what have you. Whatever the solution is, it's going to be driven by that specific community, and just making sure that the housing programs at each tribe has the ability to capture what that is, what their own community wants, and be able to implement it in a better way. And I'll just chime in really quick on this larger topic of how do you get there, and requires investment. And I think I certainly agree with everyone's comments so far, is that it's been this huge underinvestment, often purposeful or intentional. Now I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but I think there's just so much inertia to overcome that you have to match that past purposeful underdevelopment with active purpose of creating that development. And it requires all of us, so whether it's our national orgs like mine and Jackson, Lynn, all the CDFIs groups out there as well, just everyone finding that common idea that we want to be able to pursue and push and get all of our tribal communities to have that opportunity that they haven't been getting for so long. So what the right solution is, or the right type of housing, that's across the board. We had a 3D printing company come to one of our events and highlight that as a technology for mass producing homes for communities that really need a lot of homes. And they do that in international spaces, but with the number of housing shortage units that we need in Indian country, maybe that's a solution for some communities, and I hope they helpful for them. But it's really tough solution for each unique community. But I think overall we just all have to get together to expose what all the possibilities that are out there and the opportunities that they can follow up on.
Jackson, what are your thoughts there? What are your vision? What's your vision for the next 5 to 10 years? Expanding Native CDFIs, or drilling down into certain investment or co-investment opportunities?
Mm-hmm. Good question. So where we see natives, obviously we want to see Native CDFIs and the movement grow over the next 5 years. Like I said, we have 70 now. We'd like to see more. We know we won't see 570 different Native CDFIs, but we want to make sure if there are every one of the 570 tribal nations has access to a Native CDFI type product. And I think we can work ourselves toward there. And as we grow, I think one thing we can do is we can grow our voice. One thing we're doing at the Native CDFI Network is we're starting to organize in regions, and that way local regions, kind of like the Southwest region in New Mexico, they have CDFIs in Arizona that have similar similar challenges and hopefully similar opportunities, so they're able to organize that way. But also that way we can organize at a national level when it comes to things, getting back to things like the PPP, so that the next time something like this comes around, we're not left behind as we think we are. And so I think while we're here talking with Prosperity Now, who's a leader, a thought leader, and really, and also an advocacy leader, I think one thing that would be great is, I was looking at the PPP data that came out yesterday, and they do organize it by, I guess, optional reporting for every company by demographics, including male, female, and ethnicity. And really, the cursory glance that I did showed a very, 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 very small number of Native-owned companies getting that PPP. And I'm sure that's across the board with a lot of minority and underserved groups, but that's the one that we focus on. And we think that digging deeper in that data hopefully will help us increase our advocacy and make sure that we don't get left behind the next time there is something like this.
Yeah, very good. I'm going to turn it over to Gary for some closing thoughts, but let me just share a few perhaps thoughts. I just really appreciate all of you for your time, the investment that you're making in this conversation for the national audience to hear about what you're doing in the leadership in Indian country, from Indian country, for Indian country. You know, it's really hard to argue that Indian country is not beset by many challenges, you know, despite the enormous capacity and assets that we have. And what we've realized, obviously, is that those challenges differ in degree depending on where we live and work, right? And the good news is, I think, coming from this conversation, is that Indian country, and I love the way Mike put it, you know, has been on this path, you know, for hundreds of years. We are solving these problems. We are uniquely capable of innovating and persevering our way out of these pressing problems. You know, as Lynn and Tani have shared with us, you know, we've developed really sophisticated forms of cooperation that increase our chances not only of surviving, but prospering. So I definitely believe there are grounds for optimism about our future, our collective and our shared future. So I'll just share my personal thanks to all of our panelists, our online participants, for spending this time today. Gary, I'm just so enormously grateful to you and Prosperity Now for sponsoring this conversation. You know, what are you hearing? What are your thoughts? What's your vision for the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, before I say what my vision is, I can say thank you, Patrice, for helping to organize this. Thank you to Tani, Michael, Lynn, Anthony, and Jackson for being a part of this discussion. My hope is this is just the beginning of the discussion. As I move as an elder in this community, and I was an elder in training for many years, and now I've moved into eldership, I have to say that my timeline is shorter for getting something done, for making a difference in these communities. And I think in listening to the conversation, it's clear to me that people are working very hard and have much passion for a long time to change the social and economic conditions on which Native people on this planet, in this country, have existed. And Prosperity Now stands with you in any way that we can use our resource, our talent, our position in advocacy, either at the federal level or other levels, our research. We stand with you to help be directed by you, because it really has to be Native people leading the change. in Native communities. And so we stand as a support to that. Some of the things that I did hear that I'm heartened by is some of the progress. In fact, I'm still a member of the Lakota Credit Union. I think I was among one of the first members of the credit union back then at Tani. Still getting reports on how my investment is doing in that fund. So I'm so pleased that there was a vision that happened, but that vision is happening all over Indian country. The vision that happened in Pine Ridge is happening in all of these different places, and that we are at this new inflection point. We are at the chance of an opportunity to change the trajectory, but we also have to think big about what that change will need to be. And I heard a lot of conversations about home ownership, and one of the main issues that is in the way is the credit box. That credit box was designed to get the results we've been getting. And so I think we actually have to go to the core of looking at how that credit box is defined in development, because Native American people and other people of color have been prohibited from really participating in our economy because we can't maintain or create home ownership for ourselves. And so we have to look at, I think, the credit box as part of that, the answer to that question. Who's defining it? How did it get defined in such a way? And if most of us can't participate in it, it isn't working for us. And so we have to think bigger about those issues, I would argue. And then on the CDFI side, and I think many of you know I ran a CDFI for a number of years, the issue usually is equity on the balance sheets of the CDFIs to make more loans. And nobody's making that investment. So we need to be clear that building that equity on the balance sheets of those CDFIs is what's critical. And there is enough money. If we can spend trillions on the PPP, if banks and corporations can make the type of investments that they are now making, then we can build the balance sheets on CDFIs around the country, particularly Native CDFIs and those that are led by people of color. And Prosperity Now wants to put a marker there as something that we're really going to focus on. And we will work with you, Jackson, and Michael, Lynn, and Anthony to actually build that base, because you're in a capitalist society. If you don't have access to capital, then you can't play, right? You just can't play in it. So I would say that I'm just moved. Tony, I can't see you, but I know you're on the phone there. I am moved deeply by seeing some of my old friends and new friends to make a difference here. So please count on Prosperity Now to be a partner with you, and we will stand with you as you make the necessary moves that you need to make to actually make sure that Native communities are a part of the discussion, are at the table, are part of the solutions that are being contemplated for the new deal that is coming in America. So thank you.
Wow. That's beautiful. I think that's a beautiful way to end our conversation, both inspiring, heartfelt, and a call to action, right? A call to action. So with that, I'll say Bopi Latanka to everyone. And as much as we're social isolating, it does give me, make me feel really good to see everyone together. So thank you, and take good care of yourself.
Take care.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Patrice.
Bye-bye.